When they were completed in the early 1970s, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center complex in New York City were seen as jewels of commerce. For a short while, the tallest buildings in the world, at 110 stories each, had 3.8 million square feet between them of office space, and on a typical workday, accommodated 50,000 employees and another 200,000 visitors. On September 11, 2001, that changed. At 8:46 a.m., a 767 jet hijacked by terrorists hit the North Tower, Tower 1, impacting between the 93rd and 99th floors. About 17 minutes later, another hijacked 767 hit the South Tower, Tower 2, between the 77th and 85th floors. More than 17,000 people were in Towers 1 and 2 at the time the attacks occurred, and more than 14,000 people were estimated to have successfully evacuated the buildings. Dr. Martin Sherman, professor of psychology at Loyola University, Maryland, has studied the evacuation process from that morning through research with survivors. He tells ILStv about what happened on the morning of September 11th, 2001.
It took the average person in their evacuation about 60 seconds per floor in Tower 1, and in Tower 2 it took about 32, 33 seconds on average per floor. There were basically two different things that were happening in Tower 1 and Tower 2. Tower 1, they were hit. And clearly that was very different than in Tower 2, which basically was, like 17 minutes later before they were hit. And in those 17 minutes, about 90% of the people in Tower 2 had already decided to evacuate before the second hitting occurred. Even though there was an announcement that was coming across in Tower 2 that they were okay, secure, stay in your places, people had already decided to evacuate. So the Tower 1, you had a lot of individuals in the stairwells. You had first responders that were coming up, and you had debris, you had water, you had smoke. All kinds of things were in the stairwells. I think, in fact, one of the biggest things is that many of the people had never, basically they had some fire drills in the towers, and people had experienced that, but they never left their floor. They never went into the stairwells. Number one, many people couldn't locate where the stairwells were in the building, on their floor, because they'd never been in them. They'd always been in the elevators. And they did not know where to get into the stairwell from their floor. And once they're in the stairwell, many of them did not realize that some of the doors were locked for security purposes, that there were sky lobbies where you had to switch from one stairwell to another stairwell, and they didn't know that. There's a lot of sort of lack of awareness of the building and what one had to do in the event of an emergency.
To leave an area after disaster, how evacuees from the World Trade Center buildings left the World Trade Center area following the attacks, a report Dr. Sherman co-wrote, many evacuees reported that they waited for permission to evacuate before actually starting the process.
Many people were hesitant to leave because they were afraid that the supervisor would disapprove, they might lose their job. That is, their level of perceived risk wasn't very high. Those individuals who perceived high risk were more likely to make the decision to leave. In fact, the average amount of time that it took a person to make the decision once they realized something unusual was happening to the point of physically beginning to leave their floor was about 6 minutes. And when I think about back in 1993, when they had the first bombing in the basement of the trade tower, after the first responders went through the building, they still found people in the building up to 6 hours later. That there were people who never evacuated. And in this particular case, it was sort of like they didn't realize how serious it was. Well, if it's not that serious, then why should I evacuate? If I evacuate, then I might lose my job.
Dr. Sherman says the more people are aware of risks, the better they will likely be should they ever have to evacuate a high-rise. While the 9/11 Commission said the evacuation of the Twin Towers was successful for those who were below the impact zone, Dr. Sherman says there's a lot that can be learned from this experience, especially as office towers around the world continue to get higher and higher.
Getting to the points of recommendations is that there has to be a culture developed within an organization to convey to the employees the importance of safety, and that the organization themselves are going to lead that and provide their employees with plans, action plans, and what have you. If there is a pervasive sort of norm within the entire building of all the organizations in terms of making safety a priority, and being it and providing signs about safety and preparing individuals going through again, evacuating not just one building, but having 3 or 4 buildings in the same block being evacuated at the exact same time, and having people get into the streets and to experience that. I think with more experience like that, people will know it will reduce the amount of time it takes them to realize that the situation is serious, and it will also basically teach them exactly what they have to do. And that's going to be something difficult to convince organizations, to basically take time out from their work schedule and have people do this. But if we're serious about this, I mean, it can be done. I think it simply has to be out there, and people have to be informed that we need to do this. We need to prepare people for this, because we never know where and when this might happen.